Welcome to NationScope, where we peel back the curtain on the world's most classified operations. The world's most watched man didn't live in a palace, he lived in a shadow. For decades, the supreme leader was a ghost, a voice broadcast from undisclosed locations, shielded by the most sophisticated counterintelligence web on the planet. But in the high-stakes game of signals and shadows, one microscopic mistake changed everything. Tonight, we reveal the chilling, step-by-step hunt that led the CIA and Mossad to a secret compound the world was never supposed to find. The hunt for a high-value target in the 21st century does not begin with a soldier on the ground. It begins in the silent, freezing cold of a server room in Maryland and the sterile corridors of an Israeli signals intelligence base. For the U.S. National Security Agency, NSA, and Israel's Unit 8200, the supreme leader was not a person, but a puzzle of electromagnetic frequencies. They call it pattern of life analysis. It is the art of watching nothing until it becomes something. For years, the Iranian leadership operated under a doctrine of total disconnection. The supreme leader's inner circle avoided the internet, used couriers for physical messages, and operated within a grey zone of deep bunkers. However, even the most disciplined regime has a heartbeat. The intelligence community began by mapping the movements of every high-ranking official in the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC. They weren't looking for the leader, they were looking for the vacuum he created. Where the most powerful generals went, a specific logistical trail followed. Specialized medical equipment, high-end secure communication relays, and a specific grade of reinforced concrete that only appeared in the regime's most sensitive projects. The first real breakthrough came not from a satellite, but from a mundane supply chain anomaly. Mossad analysts noticed a recurring shipment of high-end Swiss air filtration systems. These weren't standard industrial units, they were medical grade, designed to scrub pathogens and chemical agents from the air in a sealed environment. By tracking the shell companies used to purchase these units, moving from Zurich to Dubai, then finally to a port in Bandar Abbas, the trail began to narrow. Simultaneously, the NSA's Tailored Access Operations, TAO, group had managed to slip a logic bomb into a firmware update for a specific brand of secure routers used by the Iranian government. They didn't listen to the calls, they simply watched the data packets. They noticed a strange phenomenon. Every Tuesday at 3 a.m., a massive burst of encrypted data was transmitted from a relay station in the Alborz Mountains. This wasn't a broadcast, it was a heartbeat. It was the ghost checking in with the world. The problem was the terrain. The Alborz Range is a jagged, unforgiving fortress of rock and snow. Traditional satellite imagery was useless against mountainside tunnels buried hundreds of feet deep. The Americans and Israelis realized they weren't looking for a building on the ground. They were looking for an anomaly in the earth itself. They deployed synthetic aperture radar, SAR, which could see through cloud cover and even penetrate the top layers of soil to detect man-made densities. What they found was a thermal bloom. Deep inside a mountain pass near the village of Lavasan, the earth was slightly warmer than it should have been. It was the heat signature of a massive underground cooling system, working overtime to keep a subterranean complex habitable. The hunters had found the lair. Now, they had to prove who was inside. While satellites and algorithms provided the map, they could not provide the heartbeat. To confirm that the ghost was truly inside the Alborz compound, the operation required the most dangerous element of espionage, human intelligence. For years, the Mossad had been playing a long game, not by recruiting radical dissidents, but by identifying the invisible people who kept the regime running. The logistics officers, the mid-level technicians, and the disillusioned veterans of the IRGC. The breakthrough came through an asset codenamed the Architect. He wasn't a spy by trade, but a specialized engineer who had been contracted to oversee the installation of a redundant power grid for a series of government villas in the Lavasan district. To the Iranian authorities, he was a loyalist. To the Mossad, he was a man whose gambling debts in Istanbul had been quietly wiped away in exchange for a few high-resolution photographs of a transformer box. But the Americans brought a different kind of asset to the table. The CIA had spent nearly a decade cultivating a source deep within the Ansar al-Mahdi protection unit, the elite Praetorian Guard responsible for the supreme leader's personal safety. This wasn't a man you met in a dark alley. This was a sleeper who communicated through dead drops that looked like ordinary trash on the streets of Tehran. His job wasn't to kill, it was to observe. He provided the pattern of life that no drone could see, the specific time the Supreme Leader's specialized medical team arrived, the brand of bottled water delivered only to his quarters, and the telltale sign of a security lockdown that preceded a high-level meeting. In early 2026, the intelligence began to coalesce into a terrifyingly clear picture. The secret compound was not just a residence, it was a dual-purpose command center. The upper levels were disguised as a modest, high-walled villa, but the lower levels were a masterpiece of hardened engineering. The CIA's source confirmed that the leader had become increasingly paranoid after the 2024 regional escalations, moving his primary office into a room of silence, a Faraday-caged bunker 150 feet below the Alborz rock. To bridge the gap between knowing and seeing, the Mossad executed a masterstroke of technical audacity. They didn't need to plant a bug in the room, they needed to turn the building's own infrastructure against it. Utilizing the traffic camera hack, a years-long infiltration of Tehran's municipal surveillance system, Unit 8200 analysts began to monitor the specific license plates of the leader's inner circle. They realized that whenever the Supreme Leader moved, the traffic lights along his route were manually overridden from a central hub. By hacking the traffic control software, the Israelis could predict his arrival at the compound with a 90-second margin of error. However, the final confirmation, the gold standard required for a strike of this magnitude, came from a piece of technology no larger than a coin. A Mossad mechanic had managed to intercept a shipment of replacement parts for the compound's backup generators. Inside a single industrial bolt, they had embedded a passive seismic sensor. It didn't broadcast a signal that could be jammed. Instead, it waited for the specific vibration of the Supreme Leader's heavy, armored Mercedes-Benz Pullman as it entered the underground garage. On a cold morning in late February, the sensor sang. The pattern was identical to the data collected over months of observation. The target was home. But as the CIA and Mossad prepared to hand the coordinates to their respective strike teams, they realized a new variable. The ghost wasn't alone. A convoy of black SUVs was arriving. The entire top tier of the IRGC command structure was converging on the secret compound for an unscheduled war council. The hunt was over, the trap was set. But the hardest part was just beginning, pulling the trigger without starting a global catastrophe. The decision was finalized at 2:30 a.m. Florida time in an improvised situation room. The objective, Operation Epic Fury. The strategy was not merely a physical strike, but a multi-layered digital decapitation. While Israeli F-15E Strike Eagles and F-35 Adirs were already refueling over the neutral corridors of the Syrian-Iraqi border, the first shots of the war were fired from keyboards in Tel Aviv and Fort Meade. To ensure the Supreme Leader's elite protection detail, the Ansar al-Mahdi, could not react, the NSA and Unit 8200 initiated a localized cyber blackout. This wasn't a crude power grid failure that would alert the entire city. It was a surgical disruption. Using the backdoors they had established years prior, hackers paralyzed the cellular base stations surrounding the Pasteur Street compound. From the perspective of the guards' encrypted handsets, the network simply appeared busy or searching, a common enough glitch in Tehran's aging infrastructure that it didn't immediately trigger an alarm. Simultaneously, the most audacious part of the digital hunt came into play, the ghost overlay. For years, the Mossad had controlled the feed of Tehran's municipal traffic cameras. As the strike team approached, the hackers didn't cut the feeds, they looped them. Security monitors inside the compound showed peaceful, empty streets from 10 minutes prior, while in reality, the air above was beginning to scream with the arrival of precision-guided munitions. At precisely 8:10 a.m. local time, the Iron Fist descended. The strike was uniquely designed for a hardened, subterranean target. The Israeli Air Force utilized a sequenced penetration tactic. The first wave of munitions consisted of Blue Sparrow air-launched ballistic missiles and specialized bunker busters designed to strip away the reinforced concrete crust of the compound. These were followed immediately by a second wave of thermobaric weapons. The goal was not just to collapse the building, but to send a high-pressure shockwave through the ventilation shafts identified by the architect in Chapter 2, reaching the deep-level room of silence where the Supreme Leader and his war council were gathered. The timing was clinical. Intelligence had confirmed that 48 of the regime's most senior leaders, including IRGC Commander Mohammad Pakpour and Defense Minister Aziz Nasirzadeh, were in the middle of a high-stakes briefing. They had intentionally stayed above the deepest bunkers, believing that a daylight meeting in the heart of the capital provided a human shield of civilian density that the Americans would never breach. They were wrong. As the smoke cleared, the digital veil was lifted. The world awoke to a new reality. The most protected man in the Middle East had been found in a place he thought was his fortress, tracked by the very cameras and sensors he had installed to keep his people in check. The ghost in the mountain was gone, and the secret compound was no longer a secret, it was a crater. The dust that hung over central Tehran on the morning of February 28, 2026, was not ordinary debris. It was the pulverized remains of a regime's ultimate sanctuary. As the digital blackout initiated by the NSA began to flicker and fail, the first grainy images of the Pasteur Street compound began to surface on social media. What people saw was a scene from a nightmare. The once impenetrable headquarters of the supreme leader, a complex that had governed every facet of Iranian life for over 3 decades, had been reduced to a smoldering landscape of twisted rebar and grey ash. But while the surface was a ruin, the true extent of the operation lay beneath the ground. The Israeli Defense Forces, IDF, later released declassified footage from high-altitude reconnaissance drones, showing the precise sequence penetration described by military analysts. The strikes hadn't just hit the buildings, they had drilled into the earth. 50 Israeli fighter jets, in a mission dubbed Operation Roar of the Harrier, had dropped an estimated 100 specialized munitions, including bunkerbuster GBU-28s. These were designed to ignore the surface structures and detonate only when they reached the reinforced concrete layers of the subterranean command center. Inside that bunker, the environment was not one of escape, but of a catastrophic physical collapse. According to post-strike intelligence assessments, the Supreme Leader and his War Council, including IRGC Commander Mohammad Pakpour and Defense Minister Aziz Nasirzadeh, were caught in a pressure trap. The thermobaric warheads used in the second wave of the strike sucked the oxygen out of the ventilation shafts, creating a vacuum that ensured even those shielded from the initial blasts would not survive. As the afternoon sun hit the capital, the Iranian state media, usually quick to broadcast defiance, fell into a stunned, hour-long silence. When the state broadcaster finally returned, the tone was unrecognizable. There were no immediate calls for holy war. Instead, there was a frantic, uncoordinated attempt to manage the narrative. However, the truth was already out. Satellite imagery confirmed by independent analysts showed that the ghost in the mountain was no longer a myth. The compound, which spanned several blocks and was rumored to house a miniature city of bunkers, had been effectively dismantled. The psychological impact on the Iranian public was immediate and visceral. Videos began to circulate of citizens in Tehran and Karaj reacting with a mixture of terror and, in some neighborhoods, a muted, disbelief-filled celebration. They referred to the strike site as the leader's house, a term once whispered in fear, now spoken as a geographic marker for a crater. The myth of the regime's invincibility, carefully curated through decades of propaganda and security theater, had been shattered in exactly 60 seconds. But for the hunters in Tel Aviv and the White House, the destruction of the compound was only the end of a chapter, not the book. As rescue crews began to claw through the debris of the Pasteur Street compound, the intelligence agencies were already looking for the next. The power vacuum created by the sudden decapitation of the leadership was already being filled by chaos. Reports of localized IRGC units taking matters into their own hands began to flood in, and the crushing response promised by the regime's few remaining voices was beginning to manifest in a swarm of drones and missiles launched toward Israel and US bases in Qatar and Bahrain. The hunt had succeeded, but the war had just entered its most volatile phase. The death of the supreme leader was intended to be a decapitation, but the body of the regime did not fall immediately. Instead, it went into a state of violent, convulsive reflex. As the smoke still billowed from the ruins of the Pasteur Street compound on the morning of March 1, the red flag of unjust blood was hoisted atop the dome of the Jamkaran Mosque, a traditional Persian signal that a great revenge was underway. The hunt for the secret compound had been a masterpiece of surgical intelligence, but the aftermath was a blunt force regional firestorm. The IRGC, though stripped of its top-tier commanders in the initial waves of Operation Epic Fury, activated its dead man switch protocols. From deep within the Alborz Mountains, in missile cities carved so deep they were impervious even to bunkerbusters, the remaining aerospace divisions began their final, desperate counteroffensive. Intelligence reports from the U.S. Navy's Fifth Fleet confirmed the launch of over 400 ballistic missiles and thousands of Shard loitering munitions within the first 6 hours of the Supreme Leader's death being confirmed. The retaliation was not just aimed at Israel. The Iranian strategy shifted to total regional cost. Missiles rained down on U.S. bases in Al-Udeid, Qatar, and naval facilities in Bahrain. The Strait of Hormuz, the world's most vital energy artery, became a graveyard of burning tankers as IRGC fast attack craft engaged in suicidal swarming tactics. For the analysts in the Pentagon and the Mossad's Red Team, this was the shatter scenario they had feared, a regime that, knowing it was dying, sought to drag the global economy into the grave with it. In Tehran, the vacuum of power led to immediate and bloody internal friction. While some IRGC units remained loyal to the Shadow Council emerging in the bunkers, others, disillusioned and realizing the extent of the intelligence breach, simply walked away from their posts. This led to a surreal duality on the streets. In the northern districts of Tehran, videos surfaced of citizens cautiously celebrating, while in the south, Basij militias engaged in frantic, uncoordinated skirmishes with protesters who saw this as their final window for revolution. By March 6, 2026, the Israeli Air Force launched a follow-up mission, Operation Roar of the Harrier. They returned to the Pasteur complex, but this time they weren't looking for a person. They targeted the Deep Archive, a subterranean server farm that contained the identities of every IRGC operative and proxy leader across the Middle East. Over 50 F-35s dropped another 100 precision munitions, effectively burying the regime's digital secrets under a million tons of mountain rock. The US and Israel had tracked down the compound using the most sophisticated digital net ever woven, but the victory felt hollow as the global oil prices skyrocketed and the threat of a full-scale ground invasion loomed. The hunters had caught the ghost, but they had unleashed a phantom of instability that threatened to haunt the region for decades. The story of the secret compound wasn't just about how a man was found. It was about the end of an era, and the chaotic, violent birth of whatever was coming next. The smoke over the Pasteur Street compound had not even settled when the second phase of the operation began. In the intelligence world, a kinetic strike is only half the battle. The other half is the digital harvest. As Israeli and US forces initiated Operation Shield of Judah, specialized cyber warfare units from the NSA and Unit 8200 were already deep inside the regime's fractured internal networks. They weren't just looking for damage assessments, they were hunting for the digital ghost, the automated systems that would trigger the next phase of the regime's survival plan. One of the most chilling discoveries made in the hours following the strike involved the smart city infrastructure Tehran had recently imported. Ironically, the very AI-powered camera network designed to track dissidents had become the regime's ultimate vulnerability. Intelligence teams found that Mossad had not just hacked the cameras. They had completely rewritten the firmware of the central processing hubs. For months, Israeli analysts had been using the regime's own facial recognition algorithms to map the social network of every high-ranking official who entered the compound. By the time the bombs fell, they had a 3D digital twin of the entire underground bunker system, updated in real time by the very sensors meant to protect it. But the hunt didn't stop at the crater. In the chaos of the leadership vacuum, the CIA's human source, the asset mentioned in Chapter 2, executed one final, high-stakes task. As the compound was hit, he managed to signal the exact frequency being used by the Supreme Leader's designated emergency successor, who was attempting to flee toward a secondary fallback site in the holy city of Qom. This wasn't a phone call, it was a burst transmission from a specialized military radio. By triangulating this signal with the now compromised Tehran cellular towers, the hunters were able to track the secondary convoy in real time. The final confirmation of the operation's success came from a mundane source, a hacked Iranian prayer app. Because the app required location permissions to provide accurate prayer times, it had unknowingly turned thousands of IRGC soldiers into walking GPS beacons. As the regime's communication lines crumbled, soldiers checked their phones for news, inadvertently pinging their precise locations to the Israeli pattern of life algorithms. This allowed the strike teams to map the exact movement of the remaining Enz al-Mahdi units as they scrambled to secure the city. By the evening of March 6, 2026, the ghost was truly gone. The secret compound was a memory, and the digital architecture of the Islamic Republic had been turned into a weapon against itself. The hunt that began with a Swiss air filter had ended with the most sophisticated decapitation in modern history. The world had watched a superpower and its closest ally dismantle a regional titan, not with an army of millions, but with the surgical precision of 1,000 invisible digital eyes. The fall of the Pasteur Street compound wasn't just a military victory. It was a testament to the terrifying reach of modern intelligence. In an era where every camera is a witness and every signal is a trail, there is no such thing as a secret compound, only a location that hasn't been found yet. As Tehran enters its most uncertain chapter, the world is left to wonder. If the most protected man in the Middle East could be found in 60 seconds, who is truly safe in the age of the digital hunt? Nation Scope will continue to follow the fallout of this operation as the regional landscape shifts. If you found this deep dive into the hunt for the Supreme Leader's compound fascinating, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more classified stories from the front lines of global intelligence.